Hello and welcome. I'm David Goldwyn, chair of the Atlantic Council's Energy Advisory Group and also a non-resident fellow at the Global Energy Center. I'm delighted to be moderating today's panel discussion on unpacking the prospects of a potential product export ban on oil markets, on the domestic consumer, and the impact it might have on our friends and allies. I have a number of administrative reminders before we get started. This event is public and on the record. We're live streaming via Zoom as well as on Twitter and YouTube. We encourage you to post about today's discussion and share on social media using the hashtag AC Energy and tagging us at AC Global Energy. Those watching via Zoom can submit your questions by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I'll try to get to as many of these as I can. If you're watching on another platform like YouTube, unfortunately, we won't be able to take your questions. So as to the topic, this summer we saw an unhappy confluence of events which really worried Biden administration officials. First was record high product exports, refined product exports. Second was a stark decrease in fuel inventories in the northeastern United States, reaching levels nearly 50% below the 5-year average. And then reports of a potentially very severe hurricane season. So starting in late June of this year, in order to incentivize the rebuilding of inventories, particularly in Pad 1 or in the Northeast, US policymakers began to weigh the possibility or the utility of imposing a ban on the export of refined products. Secretary Granholm sent a letter to refiners on August 18th, where she said, and I quote, "Given the historic level of US refined product exports, I again urge you to focus in the near term on building inventories in the United States rather than selling down current stocks and further increasing exports." She noted that the administration is hoping companies would proactively address this need. And if they do not, the administration, and again, I quote, "will need to consider additional federal requirements or other emergency measures," but did not clarify what that might mean. And I think subsequently the secretary said that the measure has not been ruled out, but wasn't at the top of the list. But the concern itself is real. How do we rebuild inventories in the Northeast? And the question we want to talk about today is whether policy measures like export bans have unintended consequences, both in terms of market impacts and on our allies. So we're going to have a discussion today about why we're in this position of risk in the first place, what the impacts of an export ban might be, and what other policy measures the administration might address or consider to better address these concerns. So to unpack this further, we are really fortunate to welcome our panelists, Sarah Emerson, president of Energy Security Analytics, Inc., coming to us from Andover, Massachusetts, and John Padilla, who's managing director for IPD Latin America, coming to us from Pineda, Colombia. Each are distinguished oil market experts who will be able to shine light on the cost-benefit prospects for a ban on oil product exports. To begin with, we'll turn to Sarah for a presentation on the drivers behind this decision and how it would affect U.S. consumers, and then we'll hear from John about the impacts on Latin America and global markets. So Sarah, we're ready for you to start whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, David. It's great to be here. This is a very interesting topic at an interesting moment for the oil sector. I've been allowed to bring a couple of slides, so I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay. Let's see, I'm going to move you guys up to the corner here. So anyway, I really, David did a perfect sort of intro as to what's happened here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications and sort of who we are as a country in terms of product trade. I don't have very many slides, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly because I know we're going to have a Q&A session. So let me start. Oops, that did not go forward. Here we go. I think the thing that we got to start with and remember is the U.S. is very, very highly integrated into the global petroleum product markets. So I just took April and I took where we exported refined products to. And if you see, I mean, we're talking many, many countries. Now, obviously, our biggest partners are Mexico and Canada, but we also ship a lot to Brazil and China. And then we ship a lot to a lot of other countries in small volumes, but still it's in many, many countries that we trade products with, that we export to. And I just want to point out on the chart on the right, David started by saying that exports are record highs, but let's put the record highs in perspective. We've been exporting about 6 million barrels a day of petroleum products since 2018. This is not new. And yes, in the last couple of months, we've gotten up to about 6.3 million, but we're still sort of hovering around 6 million. So it's not as if we're suddenly, because of the situation in Europe, that we're suddenly cranking out all these additional exports. It's a little bit higher, but it's about where we've been over the last 3 or 4 years. The next thing I want to show, and I should also say that of our exports, about 75% of them are either gasoline, diesel, or LPG. So a lot of other smaller products that we export, but that's about 75% of it. But the flip side of that was we are also a critical importer. We import petroleum products from all over the world. This is again an April snapshot. So you'll see Russia. We still have the imports from Russia. Those have been banned. But we also import a lot from obviously Canada and India, the Middle East. And so there's just an enormous number of countries that we trade with. And I also want to point out again on the chart on the right, about 2012, our imports were falling as we became more self-sufficient, and they got to about 2 million barrels a day, and they've been sitting there for since 2012. So we have actually a fairly static trade flows, but they're to many, many countries, both exports and imports. And that's just as a background, it's important to remember that. So let's talk about what's happened today. I think probably many of you are very familiar with this story. There have been, since 2019 and the closure of the Philadelphia refinery, the Philadelphia Energy Solutions refinery, we've shut down 1.5 million barrels a day, and that includes Come By Chance up in Eastern Canada, which we've either closed it or we've converted it to renewable fuels. And that's a fairly substantial volume, especially since with the Philadelphia closure and with a partial closure of the Paulsboro refinery, the East Coast really, and then the closure of Come By Chance, the East Coast really has distinctly limited or shaved back its refining capacity. So about 565,000 is East Coast and or Eastern Canada capacity, and another 500 is in the US Gulf Coast. Now you're going to hear lots about expanded capacity in the Gulf Coast, but again, it's on the Gulf Coast, it's not on the East Coast. And then in the meantime, Europe has cut back about 650,000 barrels a day of refining capacity since 2020. And most of this is a reaction to the pandemic, a reaction to the move towards more sustainable energy, and then just question marks about are refineries something we want to invest in. So that sort of is a starting point. The other thing I would mention is after the pandemic or during the pandemic, we cut our refinery throughput a lot, and in the process, at first we built up inventories of product, but then we gradually began to draw them down. So we've had this sort of three things have happened. We've cut capacity, we've cut utilization rates of the refineries in response to the pandemic. And then on top of that, in 2022, we've had to do tremendous maintenance on these refineries that were kind of idled or half idled during the 2020 pandemic. So 2020 and 2021. So we had just dramatic maintenance this year. So that means utilization rates have been low again. So that's brought us to a situation that David mentioned, which is we have low product inventories, especially on the East Coast. So let's talk a little bit about the East Coast. So this is the supply chain, how it works on the East Coast. So here, this is an example of gasoline, and this is just a snapshot using EIA data. I've rounded the numbers to keep them easy and memorable, but basically, the region produces about 400,000 barrels a day of finished gasoline after having produced 900,000 in previous years. It's down to that amount. And that takes into account blending components and blending and all of that. But in terms of finished gasoline production, it's about 400,000. It consumes almost 3 million barrels a day. So there's a deficit of about 2.5 million barrels a day of gasoline and blending components. And about 2 million of that comes from the Gulf Coast refineries on pipelines and or on tankers going from the Gulf Coast to Florida. And then there's another about 500,000 that comes, 500 plus stock change in these months, to sort of to add the additional volume of deficit. So PAD 1 is really, it's very much dependent on the Gulf Coast refineries and imports. And so I also want to just point out on the lower right-hand chart that shows the inventory situation that David started with and that I was just mentioning, with the low utilization rates, with really heavy post-pandemic maintenance. Inventories really have been drawn down dramatically on the East Coast, and they're pretty low levels. And as they were drawn down, and as crude prices took off with the invasion of Ukraine, gasoline prices got very high. And now, of course, they've come down in part because crude prices have come down. So a lot of the gasoline price spike has been ameliorated just in the last month or so. So that's kind of how gasoline works. And I just want you to remember that 2 million between Gulf Coast and PAD 1. And then also remember that there's an exports of about 800 to 900,000 barrels a day of gasoline out of the Gulf Coast, exports to foreign countries. So let's look at diesel. Diesel's a little bit different. The production levels are a little bit lower because the refineries that do operate are really focused on maximizing gasoline. Consumption's about 1.4 million on the East Coast, so there's a deficit of about 1.2 million. About 0.8 comes from the Gulf Coast refineries, and about 0.4, plus or minus some stock change, comes from imports. And then look again at the green at the bottom, exports from Gulf Coast are about 1.1 of diesel. And it's a very similar picture if you look at the lower right-hand chart. We've had, during the pandemic, inventories built up because demand just sort of collapsed, but then they began to be drawn down. And utilization rates, we've had a number of things hit utilization rates, like the freeze in the Gulf Coast. And so things like that have impacted flows and inventories. And so again, we had a price spike. Now that price spike's come down a bit, but not as much as gasoline. So we still have fairly high diesel prices, which in the United States, diesel and heating oil are essentially the same product. So that sort of shows you how the supply chain works for the East Coast. So I pulled a great map from the EIA website, and I encourage you to pull it down. I'm sure you can search for it there. And it really shows the pipeline flows from PAD 3 into PAD 1. And there are two major pipelines, the Plantation Pipeline and the Colonial Pipeline. And if you look at just their pure capacity, sort of design capacity, it's about 2.9 million barrels a day. And that the press kind of gloms onto that number. Probably utilization rates at 95% mean the operational capacity is closer to 2.7 or 2.8 million barrels a day. But here's the thing that gets very confusing when you start talking about the Gulf Coast refiners feeding the East Coast, is some of those pipelines, they deliver also to states outside of PAD 1. So they deliver to Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. So it's not quite the same as just shipping to PAD 1. So according to the EIA, also about 300,000 of jet fuel and LPG and 50,000 LPG is transported by the pipeline as well. So the actual capacity to carry gasoline and diesel is really about 2.4 million barrels a day through these two pipelines. And if you remember the numbers from the previous charts, the movements are about 2.8 million. And so that's about 2.3 through the pipelines and 500,000 by tanker to Florida. So the utilization, the infrastructure is really fully utilized. And maybe there are months when there's a little bit of room, but there's not a lot of room. And so, this idea that somehow that we're not fully exploiting our logistics, both pipeline and tanker, I don't think it's quite true. I think we're exploiting our logistics as much as possible. That means that the East Coast is absolutely dependent on imports. And when you start talking about banning exports, it means that every other country that we export to wants to compete with us or compete with the East Coast for imports. And those imports get much more expensive and frankly harder to come by. So that's sort of the difficulty of banning our exports. I'm going to end with one last slide about where do we export? If we were to ban the exports, who is impacted first? And the first location that's impacted is Latin America. So here's a map. Again, I've used April 2022 to show sort of where we export. So we export about 900,000 barrels a day of gasoline, and almost all of it, this is the chart on the right, goes to Latin America, most of it to Mexico. And we export about 1.4 million barrels a day of diesel. That includes the East Coast, the West Coast as well. And that almost all of that goes to Latin America. So Latin America is where we export products. And if we ban those exports, then those Latin American countries have to go out into the global market, the same global market that the East Coast of the United States is competing to buy gasoline and diesel from. So I just keep that in mind. I'm going to pass this off to John Padilla, who's here and is an expert on Latin America. So I'll stop there, David.
Terrific. Thanks, Sarah. That was great. And John, that's a perfect segue to you. So tell us both how an export ban might be received in Latin America, both in terms of market impact, but also maybe politically.
No, good morning, and it's a pleasure to be with everybody here this morning. And I think Sarah did a fantastic job of just giving kind of a sense of just what a global market we live in terms of both exports and imports. But as Sarah laid out there at the end, the vast majority of all that product is going to Latin America. And in particular, it's going to Mexico. So when we take a look at the gasoline side, you have 95% of all gasoline that the US is exporting going to Latin America. And of all gasoline exports out of the US, 54% goes to Mexico. So then you have Brazil, you've got Chile, there you've got a few other countries that we can certainly go into, including here in Colombia. So Colombia is short of gasoline. And on the diesel side, the Americas picks up 70% of all diesel that comes out of the United States, right? And 1/5 of that, or a little more than that, is going to Mexico. And I think it's important to kind of step back and understand these dynamics, because these imports have increased quite significantly since about 2010, and that's really off of the rise of unconventional production out of the Permian in particular, Bakken, et cetera. But that rise has given a tremendous amount of capacity to supply an ever increasing need out of these countries. There was a recent Bloomberg article that talked about how Latin America is not really kind of taking advantage of the high price environment, and in fact, oil production, which many of these countries are dependent on, have not been able to really increase their production. Really, on the contrary, with the exception of Brazil and now Guyana, every other country has pretty much seen a drop in production. So I think it's really important just to kind of understand those dynamics and what that has really meant in terms of what I would call a major source of economic policy influence for the region. So as we're right on the back of the Summit of the Americas, as the topic of immigration, particularly with Mexico and Central America, is at the helm, we have to understand that hydrocarbons continue to be a major source of policy influence, economic influence as well, that shapes our neighbors to the south. So the other thing that I want to debunk is that there were some articles that have come out and talked about just as Europe is is at in a vulnerable position, and as we're obviously moving into the fall winter season, and there's a lot of fear that we get, just like we've had these very hot summer months that are continuing, that you end up getting some very cold months. That Europe is the one it's quite vulnerable. But just to kind of put this in perspective, Europe is only taking it's less than 1% of all gasoline out of the United States, less than 1%, right? So it's a rounding error on some level. Diesel and LPG are a little bit different. They're roughly 13 and 12% based off of some of the latest figures off of EIA, I think in June. But that's not really the major source of impact here. And so I think that there's a huge concentration on these markets in Latin America, as I mentioned. When you put if we just start on the diesel side, and you put Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and you include Peru, that's over half of all of the diesel exports that go out, right? And on the gasoline side, if you put Mexico, Brazil, Chile, Canada, Guatemala, and here in Colombia, you're up to 81% of all gasoline. So the impact here in the region, you're not doing yourself any favors at a time that is a very, very kind of complicated situation following the pandemic. And I think it's worth also kind of analyzing and understanding this from the perspective of at the beginning of the year, we had a big push towards the energy transition, with Europe largely leading the way. And then life gets in the middle of things. And I think, just as Sarah was talking about on the infrastructure front, we just simply don't have enough infrastructure, and or people are not willing to kind of pay that extra money for that reliability and surety of supply. And I think that's the dynamic that we're in. I think what it's making abundantly clear is that we're not going to be moving away from hydrocarbons as fast as anybody would like to. I think people want to see that transition happening, but where we are, it's it's why we've seen prices spike. And I think that as opposed to trying to just put pressure on companies, I think it's much more fundamental to understand these dynamics, which are very complex, very global, and until we resolve those different situations that we're confronted with, particularly Pad 1, and I think the Northeast is an issue where there's just simply not enough natural gas in the system, right? And so without that natural gas, that creates a big problem. So I'll save comments on kind of the political impact, because I think that gets into a whole other range of issues, as well as where would some of these countries in Latin America get their product from, maybe for a second round.
Great, thanks, John. That's really, really terrific. Let's focus on some of the market aspects and then come back to the geopolitics. And Sarah, let me come back to you. Let's dig in for a second. I mean, the administration, when they talk about it, the theory, I think, is that if you had a product export ban, and then the gasoline and the diesel that would be otherwise going to Latin America, and as John said, and very little bit to Europe, would then need to find another home. It couldn't go elsewhere, so it would then essentially be forced to come to the East Coast. They would rebuild their inventories, and then that security issue would be addressed. Why doesn't it work that way? What's the market reality?
So I think if you say to the refiners, you no longer can export product to Latin America, they'll just cut their utilization rates. They'll stop making the product. I mean, some of it maybe don't cut exactly the same amount that they don't export. So maybe they build up inventory that lowers the price on the Gulf Coast. In theory, the arbitrage to New York should, I doubt New York comes down because the arbitrage is still constrained by the logistical constraint of how do you get it to the East Coast. So there is this idea, well, we'll just put it on a bunch of tankers. But, tankers freight rates are high right now. And first of all, it's not like there's a whole bunch of Jones Act tankers parked in a parking lot, ready to be filled up and sent to the Gulf, to the East Coast. I mean, the Jones Act industry has downsized like everyone else has, and they try very hard to keep those ships operating and plying particular routes. So it's not like you just sort of say, oh, let's get some ships and send it. So the Jones Act, they're being used already. So now you're talking about, well, why don't we waive the Jones Act and let some foreign tankers carry this gasoline? But the foreign tankers are also fully utilized. I mean, not fully. I mean, there's always one or two somewhere. But I don't think it's a situation where you've got all this spare foreign tanker capacity that is ready to carry all this gasoline, and it would require waiving the Jones Act. And freight rates are super, super high. So now you're going to pay basically the Gulf Coast price plus the freight rate to get it to New York, because you can't send any more on the pipeline. So you've got the refiners' incentive is, well, what do we do now? We'll just cut runs if you ban our exports. And so think of the exports as a pipeline to the East Coast, where Latin America doesn't buy it, and the East Coast can import it. I mean, that's the way to think about it. This idea that somehow if you cut that pipeline, all these ships and volumes are going to be available to go to the East Coast. You're going to cut runs in the Gulf Coast, and you're going to have the Latin American producers competing to get that additional barrel back to Latin America. It just doesn't work.
So in that scenario, what's the price impact on the East Coast of their imported gasoline?
Well, if the Latin American countries, I mean, think of Mexico. If Mexico had to go out into the market, into the global market, and buy product, then it becomes, a case of who can buy the most, and the price just goes up. And on the same token, they're taking those foreign flag tankers out of the market to move it to Latin America. So now you can't move it to the Gulf, to New York Harbor. So it's not, none of these things are absolute statements. That's the thing. There's always a little bit of wiggle room in all of this, but it's wiggle room. It's not solutions.
Great.
And well, then, prices would go up.
So if prices would go up because of an export ban, then what's a better policy alternative? I mean, should we have a Northeast gasoline reserve? Should we have mandatory inventories like they're doing in Europe for natural gas to use the seasons of lower consumption to make sure they don't ever go as low as they can? You've talked a little bit about Jones Act, and it sounds like that wouldn't be a perfect solution either. So what's a smarter alternative?
Well, see, I think what has to happen is we have to understand that the energy transition is not complete yet. It's a process. It's going to take 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And so we have this period where we're going to gradually transition from more fossil fuels to less fossil fuels to more renewables, et cetera, and potentially electric vehicles. So as that happens, we need to have a plan that allows for those fossil fuels to be delivered. And that's, I think right now, the investment signals are, energy transition, fossil fuels, don't invest. This is a bad business, let's not have any logistical or infrastructure investment. I understand that if you're talking about 2035, 40, 2050, but right now we have a problem in the middle. So I think what we have to do is we have to sort of say to the industry, okay, we assume the industry is going to continue to be the primary delivery of transportation fuels over the next 10 to probably 20 years. And so to do that, we're going to have to come up with policies that may be temporary, maybe build up the Northeast Heating Oil Reserve just because we don't have the logistics and little interest in investing in logistics. Maybe we make that a little bit bigger, especially on the heating oil side, which is really the more critical fuel in the winter. Maybe we go back to, this is one of my favorites, but I'm sure there are lots of people out there who won't like this, but maybe we go back to some sort of mandatory minimum operating inventory level. No oil company wants to hear that, but maybe we have to do that. Maybe we have to sort of say we never let product inventories fall below a minimum operating level of whatever it is, 30 days, 20 days, 25 days, something like that. I mean, just to be sure that we've got enough spare capacity and volume in the system to continue delivering as we go through this very long dated energy transition. And I think there's been no interest in that. It's like, it's kind of like, oh, I want to talk about the energy transition and renewable energy, and I hate fossil fuels, or it's, I love fossil fuels and they're the future. And, the energy transition is just way out there. So we as a country, we have to just be a little bit more sensitive to this, and whoever's governing has to be more sensitive to this. And I think there are little things we can do to make the system a little bit more resilient and reliable.
It's terrific. John, let me turn to you. You talked a little bit about how all this might be received in Latin America. I can just imagine, AMLO saying, "See, I told you I needed to build refineries because the U.S. won't sell me." So, if you can dig in a little bit, on what the impacts this kind of ban might have in Mexico and U.S.-Mexico relations and in other places, and maybe say a word about the inflationary pressures that these countries are under right now.
Sure. No, and it's a precarious moment right now as Secretary Blinken was down in Mexico meeting with President López Obrador yesterday, and then also having the high-level economic discussions, the H-led meetings, although energy was not supposed to be on those topics, you can be certain that it came up on some type of level. So I think that there's certainly this is a big topic, particularly as we're right in the middle of the dispute settlement consultation process. So there's technically a 75-day window which ends at the beginning of October. And what we've heard out of AMLO is that essentially energy is non-negotiable. And when you take a look at the USTR's complaint that has been filed, the very four specific items that they have put on the table, there's some of those things like low sulfur diesel, the past that they have on Pemex, as well as with respect to natural gas kind of preference to Pemex and CFE that could be easily resolved. But the other items are much more significant or much more complex and would require a change in policy. So this only ups the ante in the discussion between the two countries. Despite all of the rhetoric that López Obrador has systematically put on the table in terms of the purchase of Deer Park, in terms of the construction of Dos Bocas, and the quote unquote upgrades of the 6 existing domestic refineries, you really haven't seen much of an uptick, and it's just structural. It's quite simple. It's just you don't have enough light crude in the system. They've beat these refineries up far too much, and you're not going to see a big uptick in refining throughput. So despite what is being said, Mexico is importing more gasoline than ever, and that's not going to change in the short term, let alone perhaps in the medium term. I think Deer Park becomes an interesting dynamic to watch, because it's both the inputs as well as the wherewithal or the say on that. But when that then transitions over is a big question. So I think the other comment I'd like to make, David, is simply that we all throw around the word or phrase energy transition, but we're not really transitioning, right? We're just saying we want to get to the other end really fast. And and I think that the transition by its definition should mean that we're taking care of what it is that we have in place. And so as Sarah was saying, we have at least a 20, 30-year window. And we're not going to just be able to kind of put bubble gum and duct tape on all this stuff to keep it running. And then, as a country, are we going to, is society willing to pay the cost for these disruptions? Because the disruptions that we're seeing here today, I think, are just a sign of what additional kind of disruptions will be in the future. So if we don't kind of address these things now, it's going to be an even bigger situation later. As for Mexico and your question on inflation, I mean it's a topic that's prevalent throughout the region, and central banks this time around globally have been getting out in front of things and raising their target rates quite significantly, but to a point where you kind of say, well, it's not really having that as big of an impact as I think they were hoping, and it's basically off of the back of the pandemic where most countries were borrowing, so they're now indebted. You've got unemployment that's high, and this is a recipe for some pretty turbulent times. So it's precisely why López Obrador then took the decision to avoid what they call in Mexico the gasolinazo, where the last one that occurred really had quite significant political backlash, as it does in most countries, right? And we can go through all of the examples, Brazil, France, et cetera. So, but they're not being able to kind of curb that. And so I think if you get disruptions in the energy markets here this fall, winter, the impact on Latin America is even going to be more pronounced. And I think that's a big takeaway that needs to be well understood.
Thanks, John. That's really, really helpful. And that's a great segue to some of the questions we're getting from the audience, which really deal with Russia and the upcoming round of EU sanctions, which will come into place on December 6th, as well as the price cap. So maybe, Sarah, if I can come back to you a little bit. I mean, there are really two parts. One is, how the flow of these hydrocarbons, particularly refined products, changed since the U.S. has sworn off Russian imports. And looking forward to December, how would an export ban play into the flows of Russian products to Latin America or elsewhere? Start with you, Sarah, and then John, please come in.
Sure. So that first chart I showed that showed us importing product from Russia, that was predominantly intermediate products. So vacuum gas oil or straight run resid that would go to a refinery in the Gulf Coast and be turned into light products. We're not really importing finished transportation fuels from Russia back in April. Now, of course, that's been banned and that's gone away, and it's, refiners have had to adapt a bit. The ban on Russian products by the EU really gets started at the end of February. So at the beginning of December is the ban on crude oil, waterborne crude oil, and at the end of February is the ban on waterborne products. So we have a little bit of time here, and actually we'll be a little bit through some of the heating season. I assume I'll table the crudes discussion, which is actually in a way kind of the more interesting discussion, just because of the volumes. But on the diesel side, Russia exports something like 800,000 barrels a day of diesel. Something like 500,000 of that goes to Europe, so that would be subject to the ban. Not a whole lot goes to the other G7 countries. Obviously, the U.S. is already banned. So the question is, what do you do with that 500,000? What's going to happen to it? And if you do an analysis of trade flows, and as you saw from my early maps, I mean, there's a lot of trade going on, and we feel that some of it, a little bit's going to go to Brazil because Bolsonaro and Putin have already made a deal to do that. And I'd be curious if John thinks those numbers will go up. Some of it's going to go, we think, to some North African countries, and we think some of it's going to go to Southeast Asian countries. Not generally China and India, because they are, frankly, they're long products. So So we do think 500,000 is pretty easy to squirrel away in other countries outside of the G7. So that flow, and then what that does is it frees up volumes to come back to Europe. So the European petroleum product ban, it's going to be a little painful, but again, there's a lot of room in the system to reorient that trade. Crude's going to be a little trickier and a little sooner, but that's probably for another webinar.
Yeah, no, I think that if you free up 500,000 barrels per day, and given kind of Russia's other interests, you can be certain that they're going to look to lowball some of that pricing, and markets are what markets are. So as it is right now, I think Brazil imports of all its finished oil products something about 1.6%, right? And so there's elections coming up here, next month. But will that then fundamentally change where people are buying product from? Probably not, right? But I think that it's, as I pointed out at the beginning, I think it's just, the U.S. would lose a major source of influence, its economic influence. But and where would that product then, come from? It's going to come from, sources that would only continue to dwindle our source of influence, in the region. On the China side, Chile is the country that imports, most outside of the U.S. I mean, let's be clear. So if we just take the three largest countries in terms of refined, product imports, you have the Mexico importing 93% of all of its refined product from the U.S. Chile is importing 82% of all of its refined product from the U.S. and Brazil 75%. So Brazil is the most quote unquote diversified, if you will, but it's still 75% is coming from the U.S. If you were to turn off that valve, it's going to create a lot of scrambling, and then it just means that other actors that don't have the same interest as the U.S. are going to come into the picture, and that's not going to do anything for the region at a time when there's clearly a lot of increased concern within the Beltway, as the entire region or Latin America has essentially moved to the or largely moved to the left. And I mean, Brazil will now then be I think the big one that will put the final kind of kibosh on it. So I think that those are just considerations that are very, very relevant, and things that U.S. legislators are going to have to think about. Besides the price, besides just the supply demand issues that are clearly being faced.
So this is quite an impressive parade of horribles. As our next book bans or raise prices on the East Coast, decrease Russian influence in Latin America, potentially, increase inflation in Latin America and squeeze our European allies at the same time. So it doesn't seem like the best solution, but it's a real problem still that needs to be addressed, this inventory problem. And Sarah, I think the way you've described it, I mean, it's an inventory problem, and it's a market incentive problem because all of the incentives are for transition. So one of the questioners on the chat has asked about the Defense Production Act. So I'm wondering, between your idea of inventories or maybe the Defense Production Act, I mean, does it fall on governments, federal government, state governments, and essentially to assure the procurement of inventory on a seasonal basis in order to send that market signal? Is that a wise idea, or will that have unintended consequences as well?
Oh, I think, basically you're saying you're sort of mandating as much production as possible, essentially, I would guess. And I think the refiners on the Gulf Coast are at pretty high utilization rates. I don't think there's a whole lot of additional volume you can put into the market. The issue is it's logistics, it's infrastructure. So I'm not sure you'd get much from that. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it from a individual petroleum product side. But I think you're already making it probably as much product as you can on the Gulf Coast.
So, I mean, maybe to, just to put a fine point on it, then, if you're concerned about rebuilding East Coast inventories, I guess where you're describing it is the product is out there, but it's really a question of who's outbidding who. So if you can't move more by pipeline, you could do it by tanker or ship, either Jones Act or otherwise. But essentially, the buyer of that gasoline in the Northeast will have to pay a premium over what Latin America is buying in order to acquire that supply. Is that a fair characterization?
I think it's a case where the price mechanism generally works. So if New York Harbor prices get to a certain level, then they may even pull. They obviously import gasoline from Europe. I don't think they're going to pull any low sulfur diesel because Europe is going to be in short supply. So you'd have to go to the Middle East or India to pull in more. So the prices do work. And high prices. What's striking to me is that the price hasn't been high enough to divert shipping from other routes to the East Coast. So I think you'd probably need even higher prices than what we have, and prices have come down because crude oil prices have come down. So I guess you could get more flow on ships, but you got to bid them away from other routes at this point. So you need even higher prices, I would argue. And it's hard to do that when everyone's focused on Europe. Because they're looking at Europe and saying, well, you better build up your inventories because in the winter Russia's going to pull the plug here. So or actually the EU is pulling the plug on the Russian volumes, I guess is the way to put it. One other thing, and I think John was getting to this earlier, is the energy transition is not going to come without a pretty big price tag. And what we're talking about here is we're beginning to pay that price tag is higher because of the infrastructure, lack of investment in infrastructure, concern about the future of transportation, oil-derived transportation fuels. You're going to have these disruptions periodically, and gasoline prices are going to be high, and perhaps this incentivizes more through the IRA legislation to get EVs or hybrid EVs or whatever. I mean, there's a lot of issues there. Then you get into the battery issues and the cost issues, but I think we've got to accept the fact that gasoline is going to be a premium product for some time because of these kinds of periodic disruptions. We're not going to fix that right away.
And while we're on that, I mean, what is the biggest risk then in the Northeast? Is it about lack of gasoline? Is it about lack of diesel and heating oil? I mean, what's the real, in the event of a hurricane or something, what the administration is focused on? What's the real risk there in terms of product?
In a way, the product's there. People are just paying a lot of money for it. So, I think the risk seems to be, for the Biden administration's concerned about the election, seems to be the risk they're worried about. I mean, I'm sorry if I sound cynical, but that seems to be what the risk is that they're most worried about. I mean, all oil prices are high right now because we have a war in the middle of Europe. So the risk, I don't really worry so much about gasoline supply, there being enough for people to drive to work or whatever. The heating oil is different though, because now you're talking, and obviously there's the regressive nature of gasoline prices too, so it doesn't hit everybody the same. But the heating oil to me is still different because now you're talking about home heating, and your home heating at the end of the supply chain. So we're talking not just about the East Coast, but also the Northeast and New England. Heating oil is critical. You have to have it, and we have very low inventory. So let's say a refinery on the East Coast blew up or had a problem. I don't think a hurricane's going to hit the Northeast. Might still hit the Gulf Coast. Chances are it won't hit the Northeast. So can you deliver enough heating oil at the end of the supply chain? That to me is the biggest risk. The gasoline's kind of coming to an end because gasoline season's winding down.
Well, I think, to be fair to the administration, I think they see this as a resilience issue as much as anything else. I mean, inventories are remarkably low, and as you pointed out, the Northeast is remarkably vulnerable because of lack of refining capacity and the high demand and lack of infrastructure. But it sounds like the solutions all lie in the sort of resilient space, which are sort of incentives for more storage, incentives for alternative supply, to manage our way through the energy transition. I want to come back before the end just to talk about the impacts on Europe, because we do really care, about how they're going to be able to manage this winter and next winter. And while it's largely a natural gas problem, it really is, it's also how they're going to manage, their own refining and how they're going to get access to product if even after February when this goes into effect. And this framework may be with us for a while. So I wonder if you can just, because it's a little unclear to me, ripple through the impacts of if we were to move into this kind of a ban and Latin America then had to shop elsewhere. What does this do to product prices in Europe? Is this really is this a crude problem, or is it a product problem, or how bad is the hurt that we'd be putting on Europe in the middle of this conflict they're already enduring?
Well, what you're doing by banning exports is you're basically saying to refiners, don't make as much product. And that hits everybody. And so if Latin America is buying more, product from Europe, from say India or China or even Russia, that's less for Europe. And also the U.S. East Coast is, well, we'll assume that our own logistics would stay static, right? You're basically just taking the gasoline and the diesel out of the global market and forcing Europe to scramble now a little bit harder to get additional product once they start banning the Russian product. So it's a global market. It's not a U.S. market.
Gotcha. John, I'll give you a sort of a last word. I mean, I guess my concern would be sort of stability in the region. We have these inflationary pressures, big shift in the color of governments. Certainly moving left in a lot of places, but dissatisfaction with those governments early on about their ability to deliver quality of life. So, how concerned are you in general about sort of the stability of these governments and the potential for civil unrest? And are we adding fuel to the fire, so to speak?
No, I think that's an incredibly valid concern, because Europe has already been paying extremely high prices on all of its energy sources, and so the chances that goes even higher has a huge ripple effect. And so, there's been a lot of discussion, I think, in the U.S. that recession, no recession, but when you kind of take a look still at the supply chain issues, they're still very relevant. And for Latin America, I think that there's just a lot of unrest, and the inflationary impact typically impacts the lower income populations, with food, with fuel, basic goods. And so that hurts a lot coming off of the pandemic, where the lockdowns were quite severe. Here in Colombia, I mean, we had back in 2020, the lockdown ran through September 1st, and that just had a really significant impact, not just economically, but I think just socially, et cetera, and on morale. So I think that the point is that all of these markets, if there's one theme I think that we pushed out here today, is that these markets are just so global, that they have such ripple effects, that if you already have systems that are already vulnerable, so if we take Europe and say, these energy prices are high, they're going to go higher, they're not going to come out of any kind of economic rebound very quickly. Latin America is would be directly impacted by market dynamics, and is already vulnerable, so it's going to have a doubling down effect. it's not good from an economic perspective. It's not good from a political influence perspective. And, I think it's something that, irrespective of these disruptions, we've got to take a look at solutions, as you alluded to, David, that are much more holistic, much more comprehensive, because this is the beginning. This is not the end. This is not just a blip in a moment in time. This is something that we're going to have to face head on. Because if we take a look at like the big Texas freeze back in February 2021, there's a situation where Governor Abbott basically then looked to shut off natural gas exports to Mexico, given the political pressure. So these are things that we're going to see reoccur time and time again, and it behooves us collectively to find solutions that are much more comprehensive, so that we can attempt to avoid these going forward.
Terrific. Well, I think that's a great place for us to wrap up. I really thank you for helping you dig into a really complex problem. And I'm, my sympathies go out to our policymaker friends in the administration, because it's a real problem. And the solutions are not obvious, and they're all complex, and they all have unintended consequences. But it does seem like we need to focus more on the resilience aspect of what's going on with resilience style solutions. So thanks to both of you for participating and for the work you put into making this presentation, and for hosting today. I also want to thank our team who helped us put the event together, including Lizzie Bowen, Andrea Clabo, and Alexander Del Vecchio, Zachary Tarrant, and William Tobin. The presentation itself is going to be available on the Atlantic Council website, YouTube, and Twitter, so please share it with your colleagues, and consider joining us for the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center's upcoming U.S.-Iceland Clean Energy Summit, which will be held at the House of Sweden on Wednesday, September 21st. Thanks again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.